Welcome to Cuppa with a Doula. I'm your host, Alicia. I'm an exercise physiologist by trade. I'm also a doula and I'm a mum to two. I created this podcast over a year ago now to allow mums to have a platform to safely share their birth and parenting journey, regardless of where they birth, whether it's a hospital birth, it's a planned C-section, whether they birthed at home, and whether they had a midwife present or not. It's all on Cuppa with a Doula. And every month, I also chat with an expert in the field of pregnancy, birth, and parenting in the aim to be able to share expert knowledge and raise awareness about important topics. So if you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider subscribing either on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast from. I'm also on YouTube as well, so you can watch the interviews if you'd like. And if you wouldn't mind, please leave a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. It really helps the algorithm to find me, to then share what I do so that more mums, more parents to be can find me. So with this in mind, I'll leave you with the episode now. If you want to share your story, head over to the show notes. There's a link there and you can fill out the form and I'll get in touch with you to record your incredible birth and parenting journey. In today's episode, I am chatting with the incredible Anne. She comes to us all the way from Minnesota in the USA. And what she shares with us is her 5 pregnancies and birth. In this conversation, we mainly focus on the birth and death of her 4th baby boy, Elijah, who was stillbirth at term. This episode is incredible because Anne never thought that she would find out why Elijah died. And you will hear how she actually got an answer and how this led her down a path of advocacy. And she's now leading the way for placentas to be measured routinely in prenatal care through her incredible work at Measure the Placenta. I have put all the links in the show notes for you to have a look at this. I've linked her Instagram and website. We talk about the incredible work of Dr. Harvey Kleiman as well and why measuring the placenta is so important and could lead to the prevention of many stillbirths, especially those that happen at term. This intro also serves as a trigger warning because obviously, in this episode, we focus a lot on the birth and the death of Elijah, who was stillbirth. And then we also talk about Anne's rainbow baby, who was born after Elijah died. This is a really important conversation, and I'm so glad that Anne came on the podcast to share her story and her journey. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode. It is absolutely incredible. Thank you, Anne, for sharing it with us. Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Alicia. Thanks so much for having me.
Not a problem. You are coming to us all the way from Minnesota in the United States of America. That's amazing to have someone who's not from Australia on the podcast. There you go.
So fun. Thanks for, it's evening here and afternoon, or almost afternoon your time, right?
It is, yes. And you're living in the past. It's Friday for you and it's Saturday for me.
There you go. Amazing.
Do you want to start by introducing yourself? So
Sure.
Telling the listeners your name, where you're living, and who is in your family.
Yeah. So I am Anne O'Neill. I live in Minnesota, USA. I'm in Shoreby, Minnesota. It's a suburb outside of St. Paul.
Okay.
My family is my husband, David, and we have 4 living children, and we have a son who passed away. He was stillborn at full term. My living children are now ages almost 13. His birthday is in like 3 days. And then ages 10, 8, and 3. And Elijah, he is our 4th child. Yeah. He was stillborn back in 2018.
Yeah, so he would have been 5
5 and a half. His 5.5 birthday just passed. So, yeah.
Wow.
Whatever else I'm doing in life, I'm an adjunct instructor at Bethel University. My background is in environmental science. I have my PhD in natural resource science and management. Wow. And I always thought that I was going to go on to do like climate change research or something like that. And then after my son Elijah passed away, I got pulled into the stillbirth prevention world instead.
Yeah.
And then I also homeschool my kids, which takes up quite a bit of time. And then I teach at their homeschool co-op some too. So we're just juggling a lot of balls, but I feel like just so grateful that I have so much meaningful, joyful work and important work. So
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know how you managed to raise 4 children, homeschool them, be the director of Measure the Placenta, which is stillbirth
yeah,
prevention, and do your stuff. Have a life of your own. That's
yeah.
a lot, but good on you.
Yeah, but lots of good things. Did I say I'm the director of Measure the Placenta? No, I never actually said that. But that's I'm director of Measure the Placenta, and that's my stillbirth prevention work that I referred to
Yeah,
as trying to get placentas measured and get more attention on stillbirth prevention and the things
yeah.
we can be doing to prevent these stillbirths.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk about it as we
Yeah,
unfold Elijah's story.
yeah,
But so today what we're going to talk about is really your motherhood journey into, becoming a mom and raising 3 beautiful boys. And then we will focus on the birth and death of your son Elijah. And
yep,
then we'll, I guess, talk about all that work you're doing, which is so important,
yeah,
but then also your rainbow baby, your baby girl that came, 3 years ago after
yeah,
Elijah's passing, and
yeah,
how beautiful that would have been for you guys. So,
yeah. There's a lot to unpack, but I'm happy to share.
yeah. And thank you so much, because I know that, sharing about the passing of your son, it's not easy. It's obviously
No.
hugely personal. You must still be grieving, I'm sure, in a sense. I'm sure there's different stages of grief that you've gone through. And I mean, are you just grieving for life, really, this loss of your son that you never got to have in your arms?
Um, I would say yes, but the grief looks very different,
Yeah,
from, initially learning that he died to say a year out, and now we're five and
yeah,
a half years out. I mean, it
yeah,
changes, and I would say there's the grief. Sometimes I almost in this advocacy world, I need to make sure that I make space for my grief, which we do
yeah,
very intentionally, like on his birthdays, on anniversaries, making space for that grief, because otherwise you can't just keep going in the advocacy world and not address that
yeah.
underlying emotion and grief that is for sure there. So counseling is for sure a part of it.
Mm,
Just learning how to integrate his death into our life, how to
yeah,
talk about his death is, but it for sure gets a little bit easier
yeah,
to, for sure. I actually love talking about Elijah. That can
yeah,
seem really counterintuitive to maybe some families who haven't lost a baby, but I want to share his story. And even more than that, I want to share his story so that future stillbirths can be prevented,
yeah.
because I do believe a stillbirth was preventable. And so
Mm,
that's motivating to share his story, and talking about him for sure is helpful
yeah.
in normalizing and sort of in my own story that I tell myself in my brain, of just integrating him into my story.
Yeah. And so for me, as someone who hasn't lost, a baby like you have, something I have learned along the way is that moms who have lost, one of their child, whether it's a stillbirth or it's they birthed their baby alive, but he or she passed away a few days or
Mm-hmm.
shortly after their birth, is those moms and those parents, they want to talk about their children. And it's something, and we'll go
Yes.
into it a bit later when we unpack your story, is
Yeah.
a lot of people don't know what to say, what to do when they learn that their friends or their their cousin, their sister has had a loss. And
Yeah.
what I've learned is that for the most part, those parents want to talk about their child. They don't want that
Yes.
child to be the, oh no,
Yeah.
let's sweep it under the carpet, let's never mention him or her. They want to talk about this child, even though obviously
Right.
he's not
They will
alive.
never forget their,
No,
yeah.
exactly. But it's important to keep the legacy and the memories going
Yeah.
for the family, for everyone.
Yeah. And if friends can figure out how to, talk about the baby who passed away, that really, the future of a friendship really hinges on that. If
Yeah.
the friends can figure out how to talk about the baby who has passed away, and if they cannot figure that out, that oftentimes those friendships will die.
Yeah.
So it's really important for friends to learn how to talk about this,
Yeah.
and yeah. So thanks for having me on your podcast. I hope
My
it's part of
pleasure.
normalizing stillbirth.
Yes. So, Anne, I asked this to every one of my
Yeah.
guests. Did you
Mhm.
always want to be a mom?
Yeah, as far back as I can remember, I did want to be a mother. I did sort of wonder and worry, like my junior high, high school. I also had dreams and ambitions like for career and education, and
Yeah.
I knew that I didn't want to only be a mother. And for those who choose to stay home full time and bless them, that's totally no
Yep.
problem. But I knew that I wanted education. I wanted that and went on and pursued and got my PhD. Having said that, though, then I was pulled back more to the home front when our oldest, our living son, has some special needs. And I was like, he just needs mom around more to help him through some of that. So, but it's always that kind of trying to balance it. But I always knew that I wanted to be a mom. Yeah, that was
beautiful.
important to me.
And so back almost 13 years ago, when you fell pregnant with your first son, was that something you had planned with David?
Yes. So at the time I was juggling trying to finish my PhD and having children and trying to, so it's actually the first 3 kids were planned all around my PhD milestones.
Okay.
It doesn't always work out this beautifully, but it kind of worked out well for us. Like my first child was born right after I was done with full-time classwork. My second child was born after I was done with all my classwork. And my third child was born 2 weeks after defending my dissertation. I was done. So it was trying to stitch this together. How do I have babies and do the PhD? So there was a lot of calendar counting and when am I going to ovulate and when can we get pregnant and not sink the PhD. So I remember and look back on that wow, that took up a lot of my brain space back in the days of trying to balance becoming a new mom and finishing an advanced degree. So somehow it happened. I have a funny picture after my third was born of I'm 9 months pregnant and I'm off to defend my dissertation. And then 1 month later, I'm holding a baby and a diploma. And it was nuts. I had all kinds of help though, from my husband, from my parents, but it was kind of a journey there with those first 3 living babies. Yeah.
Did you stop when you've had, your first, your second, your third? Did you take some time off your PhD to, mother?
Well, I wanted to, and I remember going to my advisor hey, I'm pregnant. I would like to take some time off, after my son is born to just nurse him and hold him and be mom and not be worried about due dates and deadlines. And he was like, oh yeah, no problem. You'll still get the stipend. And I was well, 'cause I was on some grant scholarship where we had a big deadline in May. Yeah. And I was well, does that May deadline shift at all? And he was no, the deadline's still all the same. And I was well, that's not really time off then, is it?
Yeah.
But he was well, if you can convince the U.S. federal government to move that deadline, then we can move that deadline. And I was well, I can't. So no, I mean, he was flexible with me, but I wouldn't say that I had time off in the sense of reality of deadlines moving. So I don't know. We juggled it. He was very supportive as much as he could have been. My advisor, no, I wouldn't say I really had time off. Other than that, I did have a very flexible schedule. I could work from home. Yeah. I could work when he was napping, that kind of stuff. So yeah. And I can't say I did my best work then or anything, but people were gracious and it shouldn't rely. I mean, I should have been able to have time off. It shouldn't rely on people's graciousness to, survive that. But that's what ended up happening.
Wow. That's a tough, a tough, entering into motherhood because, well, obviously you wanted to be a mom and you don't want to have to wait for your PhD to be over. When you want to be a mom, you just want to be a mom, but you also obviously you want to finish your PhD at the same time, obviously. Yeah. And it's oh, okay, well, I'm going to take some time off. Oh, wait, my deadline's not moving. I can't take time off then. No.
Yeah. It's not good. It's not ideal. And I know there are advocates out there working on that because that's not how it should be. But that was the reality that I faced. And I didn't want to choose. I wanted both. Both. And so I was willing to kind of
make it work.
Make it work. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. Then in hindsight, we did make it work. We just did the best and it was okay.
Yeah. No, that's great. So let's go back to the pregnancy of your first son. So did you know much about pregnancy back then? Did you kind of know, what was going to happen after you find out that you're pregnant?
I would say I knew about as much as the average kind of first-time pregnant American mom. I certainly I read a bajillion books and research articles and blogs and trying to figure out what is happening. Why do I feel like I'm gonna, I knew about morning sickness, of course, but I actually didn't have that much morning sickness. It was really from it sounds terrible, but it was actually not super hard pregnancies. which is a good thing. I shouldn't say it's terrible. It's a good thing. They were relatively easy pregnancies. I'm trying to remember. I remember I burped a lot for some of them. Like there's some kind of burping going on. I was like, how does that? I don't read a lot about that in the books. I remember being extremely tired. I just took a lot of naps, but nothing that really was, I didn't have any super complications. So
Yeah.
when they asked me, would you like to opt for midwife care? I said, sure. I seem like a low risk, low, just not a lot of issues. So let's go for midwife care. I liked the fact that they would be more with me during labor, and I kind of
Yeah.
wanted that emotional coaching and support as opposed to the doctor just rushing in right before, as babies, right about to be delivered. So I did opt for midwife care, and I loved it. I have loved being cared for by midwives. They just strike me as some of the most amazing people in the world, how they just patiently wait and encourage. And yeah, so I've actually formed like a lifelong friendship with the midwife who delivered my 3 living babies, and also she delivered Elijah.
Wow.
Yeah, and
Special.
I think that's kind of rare to have the same person delivering like all of your babies. Our 5th baby, our rainbow baby, was delivered by someone else because my midwife wasn't practicing at the time.
Okay. Yeah.
But I feel such a kinship with her. Her name is actually also Anne, which probably helps.
Oh, I see.
um, but yeah, she's caught first 4 babies, including Elijah, and like anybody who is associated with Elijah and his stillbirth, like just hold a really special place in my heart for
Of
them
course.
just being present in that really difficult moment. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like we lucked out having Anne present, midwife Anne present at our first 2 babies, and then after that, I asked, I need you there. Can you please be there for babies 3 and 4? And she was there. So
Oh, that's
um,
amazing. And so, I
yeah,
mean, just to do a little side note, because obviously you're in the USA,
yeah,
which is a different model of care. So I
yeah.
think from my understanding is, so us in Australia, we usually you'd go through a midwife-led care for your pregnancy
Uh,
unless you have complication, and then you might
oh,
see a mix of midwife obstetrician unless you opt to have a obstetrician privately, usually covered under health insurance. To kind
oh,
of
that's good.
summarize super quickly the differences, and then obviously we have home birth options and free birthing as
Hmm.
well. And
Oh,
so
that's
my
interesting.
understanding of it is you guys, is it mostly obstetrician led care unless
Yeah.
you're low risk, just like you, and then it's midwife led care?
I would say even a lot of low risk women in the US have OBs. I
Uh
think the
huh.
OB model of care is far more common in the US
Ah,
than midwife care. I remember thinking at the time I was a little strange for having a midwife, electing to have a midwife care for
right.
me, because I think most women select OBs just for routine healthy
Yeah.
pregnancies, even. So, yeah, I think that is different
Ah.
between the States and a lot of other parts of the world. But
See, that's really interesting because if you think about what an OB and what a midwife is, so an OB is, it's a highly trained doctor that has gone on to really specialize into anything, gynecology and obstetrics. And
hmm.
they are in a really good spot if you have, complication or you've got, health, a health history to take into account there. But for a healthy low risk pregnancy, well, they're like, they've obviously got the skills, but they're highly trained for anything,
Yeah,
out of the ordinary, let's say.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like they're probably kind of like, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah,
yeah,
everything's going fine. Yeah, okay. And as you said, they're probably not as involved in, the labor itself. They probably just,
right.
maybe I'm making an assumption, they probably just rock up when the woman's pushing, I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep. And until that point, a lot of like hospital nurses are more involved in sort of like
Ah, uh-huh.
coaching through labor or preparing for delivery. And then, yeah, the OB, and this is different. The OBs differ too. I don't want to like
Yeah.
paint
Yeah,
them
of
all with a
course.
broad brushstroke, but on average, yeah, the OBs for sure are less involved than the midwives in the course of like the earlier
Mm.
stages of labor.
Yeah. Whereas a midwife,
Yeah.
they really want to educate the woman. They really want to talk about how to prepare for your birth, how to
Yeah.
prepare, what's going to happen in your pregnancy, how to
Yeah.
prepare for parenting. And they have a bit more of a, I guess, educational side of things, support, obviously they're there physically to support
Yeah.
you, but they've also got this emotional side of support where, they will, in labor when you go, oh, I can't do it. They're like,
Okay.
they're like, you doing it, mate. Like, just
Try this,
yeah,
or try that.
exactly.
Yeah,
Let's
you
change
can do this.
position. Let's go
Yeah.
to the bath. Like
Yep.
they're
Yep.
really hands on. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
not that they've got their hands on you, because sometimes
Yeah.
they're just there to suggest, reassure, and or just
Yep.
sit back and watch. It really depends on, they know
Yeah.
what the woman really wants. If they really want, their hand held, then maybe so be
Yep.
it. But otherwise, they're
Yep.
there to keep an eye out, see
Yep.
if anything arises. But
Yep.
otherwise, it's,
Yeah.
suggestions and or sitting back and letting, the woman and their birthing partner, be a team and work through this
Yeah.
and give them that space to
Yep.
birth.
Yeah.
Um,
One kind of amazing midwife stories, because I had three natural vaginal deliveries for my first three children who are all alive, and the first two were born in a water tub.
yes.
Per my midwife's suggestion, why don't we just try it? And then it was a great suggestion. And then baby number three, I was doing the same thing, and I almost sort of assumed like, oh, it worked for babies 1 and 2. Of course, I'm just going to go labor and deliver in the tub again. And she noticed, she was like, Anne, you're just not responding the same way in the tub with baby three as you did with babies 1 and 2. Like when you got in the tub with babies 1 and 2, I could tell like it helped you relax. You were just more focused on your work. But when I hopped in that tub with baby three, she was like, it got worse, Anne. I could see the facial expressions expressed more pain or anxiety or something. And she was like, the tub just isn't right for this baby. She's like, I don't know why. This baby just isn't a tub baby.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
like she noticed that and she observed it and she helped me in that way. And I just thought that takes a special level of like her knowing me trusting her, for her to say, this isn't what you need right now. And I just completely trusted her. I was like, you're right.
Yeah, that's
Pretty
absolutely
amazing
amazing.
though, how
It
she can do
is.
that. And she was spot on.
Yeah.
I delivered baby number 3 on land.
Wow. And see, that's exactly what midwives do. They just look at you and they can just tell, they don't have to do a vaginal examination to know how dilated you are. They can tell, they can hear, your little noises. They can almost hear before you push, and you've got that breathing. They just know you're about to push, or they can see that, oh, you've shifted in that position. That's a good sign. Or they can just tell. And I'm amazed at it, I'm like, wow. Like, and obviously so special because you had the same midwife. So she knew what how you labored, what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy. And she was able to go, oh, well, you've enjoyed the tub, great. Let's go into it. And then go, oh no, that's not going to work. Let's get out. Wow.
So just amazing what she does. Yeah.
So you've said you've had so basically your pregnancies have been very straightforward, normal in terms of I guess your your ultrasounds and so on. You went through the motions, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I went through the motions. I did what was recommended. I did, with baby number 2, I did have some bleeding. I remember you got to get the stories out of me. This is good while you're asking. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. This is 10 years ago. But now I remember it was terrifying in the moment. I did have bleeding around week 8 or so. And I thought, this must be a miscarriage. I mean, it seemed to me it was, filling a pad. And I just thought, this is pretty heavy. This must be a miscarriage. So I went in to the clinic. It was a different midwife on call, but she was like, yeah, I mean, she still heard a heartbeat. So there was still hope that, our baby was still alive. But she was like, this doesn't look good. I think this is an impending miscarriage. It just hasn't happened yet. And so I went home. I had heard my baby's heartbeat.
Yeah.
But we thought he's going to die. We didn't know gender at the time, but we thought this baby isn't going to make it. That was horrible, knowing my baby is inside of me. And as of right now in the clinic, he's alive, but I think he's going to die. And it's 8 weeks. There's nothing I can do about it.
No.
There's nothing to be done. So needless to say, it was a lot of like horrible waiting. And they brought me back into the clinic the next day and I was still bleeding and there was still a heartbeat. And we were like, okay, how much can a person bleed and still be pregnant and not miscarry? So they eventually diagnosed me with a subchorionic haematoma, which I've since learned are somewhat common. However, when I read the book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, they only ever talked about first trimester bleeding with miscarriage. It didn't really talk about first trimester bleeding and baby can survive. I mean, it's still certainly not good. The blood, I guess, can cause irritation of the uterus, and it's certainly not a good sign if it is happening, but it's not 100% fatal. We learned that.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
So that, come to think of it, that does feel a little bit like like a miracle or something that happened. He did survive, and the hematoma slowly resolved. I guess it was kind of reabsorbed back into my body. And by week maybe 14 or 16, they couldn't see it at all, and everything
Wow.
was tracking fine. So for a while, they were sort of treating me like high risk by giving me a bunch of
Yeah.
scans, but then by week 14, 16, they were like, everything looks completely normal. So it was
Wow.
back to like low risk kind of
Mm-hmm.
routine. They gave me all those extra scans, but then by week 16 or whatever, I was back to like normal, just the scan at week 20. And at least in the States, for my earlier pregnancies, I just had a scan at week 20 and that was it.
Yeah.
And then that's it.
Yeah.
I've since come to believe that is not enough. Every person should have a third trimester ultrasound scan, because that's when you can actually like see a problem and potentially intervene.
Mm,
But yeah, back in
that's
the day,
true.
just the 20-week scan.
Yeah, and see, we have the same. So we've got, it's all recommendation. You don't have to do all of them. You don't have to do, you can do whatever you want, and
Yeah,
that's something I, like to say on the podcast. Recommendation is you can do a dating scan. It's called a dating scan to try and, estimate your due date. I've
yeah,
always loved to do a dating scan to see the baby, because for the people that conceive and they've decided to conceive, you usually know when you've conceived, so you can kind of
kind of
estimate,
guess. Yeah,
really. So yeah, I've always loved to do it to see the baby personally and
yeah,
to see the
yeah,
heartbeat.
yeah.
And then you do a 12-week scan, so that's where they start taking measurements, they start checking that things are where they should be. And then the 20-week scan is the big one where they measure, organs. They do a lot more measurements of, the bones. They check the structure in the heart. They check that everything is where it should be again. And they check where is the placenta. And that's about it. Well, they do
Yeah,
check the cord insertion of the
yeah.
placenta, which is done at the 12 and the 20-week scan. And they check
Okay,
where it's located, 12 and 20-week
okay.
scan again, and that's about it in terms of the placenta. And
Uh,
we're going to talk about
yeah,
why this is relevant in a
that's not
second.
enough.
And yeah, and that's
Yeah,
it. So for us, again, if you've got a low risk pregnancy, there is no flags, there's nothing. After
yeah.
20 weeks, you're not seeing your baby anymore, which for
So
me was
that's
really
what is
sad.
20 weeks is the last scan
Yeah,
that they would offer you on a standard healthy
yeah,
pregnancy. Oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
But three, you can have up to three: the dating scan, the 12-week, and the 20 week.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
that's
then you
yeah.
can have a what we call a growth scan. But
Okay.
like, so if you've got a low risk healthy pregnancy, you kind of have to fight for it, because they'd go, well, there's no reason to give you this scan,
Mm,
even though it's like, well, if you want a scan, like, let's get a scan, I mean, if we're talking money for those scans, you might have to pay privately. There might be some out of pocket fees.
mm.
If you want to pay for your scan, it's your decision. I would love to
Yes.
say that, I would love
Yeah,
to
it
say,
should
you know what,
be.
if you want your scan, ask for it, find
Yeah.
someone who will give you a
Yep.
referral, go and
Yeah.
pay for it. Perfect, which was my case. I wanted to pay for a scan because I wanted to check on my baby, and that's
Yep.
fine.
Yep.
And yeah, so unless there's any risks, unless they've, checked baby at 20 weeks and they've gone, oh, let's follow up on this measurement, this, growth, this whatever, you don't have a scan in the third trimester. If there has been anything that's been, oh, let's check on this, then you might get a scan at 30, 32, 34, maybe 36
Interesting.
weeks, any of those or all of those, or it really depends on case by case, what's happening,
Hmm.
what is the issue, does it need to be monitored every 2 weeks or something. And that's, at this point, you might have gone onto an obstetrician led care, which means they might want to check more often to
Sure.
see how this thing is
Hmm.
arising. But otherwise, yeah, after 20 weeks you've got no scans, so it's
That's
like,
so
yeah.
you're ahead of us in the States, because I was only offered 20 weeks, but I think now it's more common to do a dating scan in the States. But a 12-week
Uh-huh.
scan is not common,
Oh,
and
right.
after 20 weeks is not common in a standard low risk pregnancy, which
Yeah,
is
right.
terrible. I have a
Yeah.
friend who actually gave birth in Japan, and she said she was offered an ultrasound every single appointment if she wanted one, every month.
Wow. That's
Yeah, they
See,
like.
that's cool.
Isn't that interesting? Like, I
Yeah.
think it's important to realize, like, there's no set in stone universal
No.
standard of like, here is what we do, here's what's backed by the evidence. Like, no, it's a lot more to do with like funding and politics and culture and preference. And
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that should be empowering to women to say, you know what, I want more scans, or I want less scans, or I want this
Yeah.
different kind of scan. To just say, like, this is what I need for the care
Yeah.
of my baby and my psychological health. And I think you are well within your right to ask, given
Yeah.
the wide range of normal and variation around the world.
Exactly. And that's something I say on the podcast is you can say no when they say, oh, well, we will do a 12-week scan. The language is so important. When you hear something like, we will do this, you're not hearing, oh, are you happy for us to proceed with a 12-week scan? Obviously, but it is a question. It doesn't sound like it, but it is a question. And you can say no. Just like you can say, sure, I'd love to see my baby at 12 weeks. Perfect. Yeah. And just like when they say, oh, after 20 weeks, oh, no, there's no scans, you can say, no, hang on, I want to have a scan. Like, I genuinely want to, give me the referral. Or you can, or for some people, they want only the 20-week scan because they go, well, before that, I'm not very interested. At 20 weeks, I want to check everything's fine. After that, if everything's okay at 20 weeks, I'm happy to just go on with my pregnancy. Good. It's all dependent, and it should be in the woman's hands to decide what she wants to do, not the care provider, not what the care provider wants to see or do or measure. It's the woman's decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there other branches of medicine that are so just make broad sweeping assumptions about what the patient must surely want? Like, I mean, would you ever do that for a cancer patient and just assume they want to approach their treatment this way? No, of course you ask and you dialogue and you say, what do you need? What do you want? What does this look like for you? You are the patient. You should choose. So I do think I don't know. I think maybe providers get into like a routine and they just feel comfortable with their routine. I don't know, but patients have every right to question and ask, why this standard and why not that?
Exactly. And this is something that I'm promoting as much as I can on my podcast is ask questions. Say no, say why, say, let me think about it. I'll come back to you with an answer next appointment. But for now, I need to do my research. I don't want to make this decision right now. I want to think about it. Cool. Okay. And do your research. There's so much information out there. Obviously, it's not always easy to find, stuff if you don't know what you're looking for, step one. But there is so much information. And nowadays, there's so much, podcasts. There is research papers. There is blogs. There is vlogs. There is YouTube videos. There is, whatever. It's out there. Obviously, heaps things to filter through. But there's usually some ways to find out the information in a way that is, that makes sense to you, whether you love to read, you love to listen, you love to visualize, you love to, see it, there's always something out there for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's relevant talking about the placenta, what placental, measurements or, ultrasounds were done for your first 3 pregnancies?
So I have gone back since Elijah's stillbirth. I didn't, first of all, while I was pregnant with them, I didn't even think to ask, are they measuring the placenta? Are they looking at the placenta? I hardly even knew what a placenta was during those first 3 pregnancies. I just took so many things for granted. And I look back now and I'm like, oh, I wish I would have known. But they looked at the location because that's a risk to the mother. I'm sure they looked at the cord insertion. That's pretty standard. Where in the placenta is the cord inserted? Is it more central or more marginal? Because there are risks associated with that. But I did look after Elijah's stillbirth and placentas suddenly became very important and relevant to me. I went back to my living 3 babies and looked, like, did they weigh the placenta after birth? They did not. And if they did, they didn't record it. So I'm forever wondering, what were the placenta weights of my living 3 children, because that became an important part of Elijah's story. I have images. I have ultrasound images of my 3 living babies, prior to Elijah, their placentas, but really nothing else other than location and cord insertion and an image of it. And that's pretty standard. And as a parent, I didn't even know. You don't know what you don't know, right? Until something goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And that's something I love to say. You don't know what you don't know. And when you have a stillbirth or, your baby is born alive but dies shortly after, it's not your fault. It is not your fault. Okay. I just want to say that for anyone out there who's going through this, has gone through this, is going through different stages of grief. It's not your fault. It's not because you didn't ask. It's not because you forgot to mention it. It's not your... You don't know what you don't know. Like, obviously, you didn't know how important the placenta was because the system didn't tell you that the placenta was important. And the system doesn't even know that the placenta is important.
My providers didn't know either. And, so
Exactly.
you're exactly right. It's a systemic issue, just in lack of training, lack of knowledge,
Yep.
lack of research being implemented into
Yes.
prenatal care. It just kind of gets stuck in the lab and it doesn't get transferred over. And that is
Exactly.
by no means the patient's fault. You can't,
No.
no patient can be there, like, surveying the literature and the research, like, what's every possible threat to my baby, right? That's the job of the professionals around you.
Yeah.
And it's just, there are almost no causes of stillbirth that are the mother's fault. And I
No.
think you're going to have a guest, Dr. Kleiman, on eventually, and he'll say the same thing, and he can tell you more of the science behind that. But
Yeah.
he does review, stillbirth cases and tries to figure out what caused the stillbirth, and he will say the exact same thing. It is not your fault.
No. Not at all.
It's just not.
None at all. That's right.
But I
And
can say, in the lack of having answers, when you don't know why your baby died, your brain just automatically goes there, right? It
yeah.
must be my fault. He was inside of me. Elijah was
Yeah.
inside of me when he died. And so if we can't figure out a cause, well, then surely it was me. It was something I ate. It was something I did. It was, whatever. Like, you just make up stuff. Maybe I stretched too. Yeah, your brain, it's like we have a hard time not knowing what caused it. And so then we just start to make up stuff,
Yeah.
even if it's not like evidence-based or research-based.
No.
And because it's hard to not have an answer. It's hard to not have a cause. But it's worth saying, again, it is not your fault. Like, it is,
Exactly.
it's just not.
Yeah. And the hardest thing in pregnancy is when you're pregnant, you're growing the baby. The baby's inside of you. It's, even though obviously you've conceived it with your partner, your husband, your wife, you're the one growing the baby. It's what you're putting in your body that gets to the baby and that feeds the baby. So if something goes wrong, whether it's, in pregnancy, in delivery, it can feel like, well, the baby was my responsibility. I was growing this baby and then something went wrong. So therefore it's my fault.
Yeah.
No. It's not your fault. And usually that's usually the first place that, we go to, because it's like, well, I must have done something wrong. And I mean, nowadays, if you look at guidelines on what to eat and what not to eat in pregnancy, if you happen to eat, I don't know, a cheese that you didn't know you were not meant to eat in pregnancy, then how can you not go into this place of, oh, that's going to be harmful to my baby. Like, my baby's going to die right now because I've eaten this blue cheese that I wasn't meant to, because these guidelines are telling me strictly, do not ever eat this cheese while pregnant.
Yeah. And there's no category for like blue cheese as a cause of death in the stillbirth charts. It doesn't exist.
No, exactly. So all of that to say, it's not your fault. And if you want to eat blue cheese in pregnancy, go eat blue cheese, it's probably fine, But just to put a little bit of, funny spin on it, it's not your fault. And when you don't know what you don't know, and it's not your sole responsibility. Obviously, if you smoke in pregnancy and you know of the risk of smoking and its effect on the fetus, and you continue to smoke, that's another can of worms there. But usually, as you said, stillbirth cannot be attributed solely to the mom, or saying, oh, you lied on your left side when you went to sleep. That's why. Yeah. No.
Yeah. I mean, I can say, right, the number one cause of stillbirth is placenta problems.
Yeah.
And I mean, it might have to do with like the placenta didn't get implanted into the uterus well, or it could be like a cord issue, cords getting wrapped around, or it could be an abruption where the placenta tears off the wall of the uterus. None of those are caused by the mother doing anything or not doing anything. No. And genetic issues are roughly 10% of all stillbirths. Maybe it didn't get caught on the 20-week scan, and then there's some kind of fatal heart defect that is not survivable. So you should definitely talk with Dr. Harvey about that when you interview him, and he can go over that and just reassure people that it's not your fault. The causes are not.
Exactly. So let's go into your fourth pregnancy. So with Elijah, had you planned to conceive him when you did?
Yes. We felt like we can have a baby anytime we want now, because I was done with my PhD, and I was like, this is going to be so fun. I'm going to be pregnant and not working on a PhD. It's just going to be so relaxing. Pregnancy is not relaxing, by the way. It's hard work. But I was happy to not be juggling a PhD. I was, however, caring for 3 living children, so I was busy, and I look back on that now, like, was I fully paying attention to all the signs and warnings? Not that that causes death, but I was busy. But I also felt like, okay, I'm an experienced mom. I've
Yeah.
done this. I've been pregnant before.
Mm-hmm.
So I was not worried in the least. Everything felt normal to me. Everything felt the
Mm-hmm.
same. You know, feeling his movements, feeling, his growth trajectory. It just felt very normal to me. And I remember too feeling like, okay, I'm an experienced mom. I don't need to panic. I'm not going to be the
Mm-hmm.
stereotypical irrational pregnant woman. I'm cool. I
Mm-hmm.
got this. And I think, in hindsight, I regret some of my, you know, lack of concern. Like, you're still pregnant, right? I'm still carrying a baby inside of me, and I need to be alert and aware for, changes in movement, or like what's my normal, and, being aware of my baseline. I only sort of had that in the back of my brain. I wish that was more in the front of my brain. But yeah, it was a very normal, healthy pregnancy. One weird thing pregnant with him, he was so active, and all of my other babies actually kind of came on the early side. Like, they came
Yeah.
naturally at 37, 38 weeks. And
Yeah.
so around like 35 weeks, I was like, I think he might be breech. And
Okay.
I didn't want to have a C-section for breech.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked, and my midwife, or either I asked or my midwife offered, I don't know, but we were on the same page. She just said, why don't you go in for an ultrasound at 35 weeks just to confirm his fetal positioning?
Yeah.
So, if he's not head down, then you can do the, whatever exercises trying to get your baby
Yeah.
to flip. And so I said, that sounds great. So with Elijah, I did actually have an ultrasound at week 35 and 37, not
Uh-huh.
because we had concerns about his health or my health. It was just to confirm fetal positioning.
Yeah.
And so both of those scans came back, and he was actually head down. I was like, well, I think he's flipping in between scans, but I was glad at least at the time of the scan, he was head down, again, trying to avoid a C-section. And I remember thinking two things. I remember thinking, number one, surely a C-section is like, gotta be one of the worst outcomes. And of course, I regret that so deeply now. A C-section is just fine. You want a living baby, healthy mother. Like, that is the goal. So that's a regret though. But I was trying really hard to avoid a C-section.
Yeah.
In part, stillbirth was just not on my radar. It was like, I knew it existed, but I didn't think it would happen to me. I thought it was
Mm-hmm.
super rare. I thought
Mm-hmm.
it just was like, again, I didn't want to be irrational or hysterical or, worried about unnecessary things. So I
Mm-hmm.
just was like, not worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
I also remember thinking, and I sort of kicked myself for this, but I remember thinking, third trimester, pregnant with Elijah, I remember thinking, oh, I'm so lucky. And Elijah was going to be our last baby. That was the plan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so lucky. I've never had to endure a miscarriage or pregnancy loss or stillbirth of any type. Like, how did I get through life without having to endure that? Because it's so common, because so many women go through, at least in my, miscarriage, that was to me common. I'd had many friends go through miscarriages and such. And so I now look back, of course, and kick myself like, oh my gosh, I wasn't holding a living baby in my arms, and I thought he was safe. I thought that I took it for granted that he would be born alive. Babies aren't born alive until they're born alive. And so I share that just of like, stillbirth can happen to anybody, even healthy, low risk pregnancies. And I don't, again, this isn't to scare anybody. This is to inform people, like, pay attention, be alert, ask questions. Do not worry about being the patient who asks too many questions, or the, stereotypical irrational person. No, your questions are good, and your questions are legitimate, and your questions are a sign that you're paying attention and you're a good patient. And don't worry about what anybody thinks of you. If you're concerned, just go into labor and delivery. That's a message that I think that I definitely wish I would have heard when I was third trimester pregnant with Elijah. So as far as his story, like finding out how he died, it was a Sunday morning. I remember feeling him on a Saturday evening. I was sitting on the couch watching YouTube with my husband, and I remember things felt normal, but I was really tired. And I woke up Sunday morning, and I was like, wow, I slept really well. This was amazing. Because normally I wouldn't sleep that well. Sleep is hard when you're pregnant. I'd wake up and have to go to the bathroom. But that Saturday night into Sunday, I slept really well. And I woke up that morning and was like, something feels off. I don't feel him moving, but I'm going to keep tabs on this. I didn't call my provider right away. I should have. But I was like, I'm just going to keep tabs on this and see when I feel him move.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like, time went on, and I was watching my other kids, making breakfast, all that. I didn't feel him moving. So I finally called my midwife like late morning, early afternoon. And she unfortunately said to lay down, drink juice, which we know now is terrible advice.
Yeah.
That's not what she should have said. But she said, if you're still concerned, in an hour, then call again. So I called again in an hour because that didn't do anything. And then she said, come in, let's get checked out. even at this time, I was like, something seemed like it was wrong. I didn't feel him moving like I normally did, but it still didn't seem possible that maybe he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't alive, that maybe he was dead. It was just sort of like that much. That's too horrible. I almost,
Yeah.
I don't know. I just needed to block it out or something. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, my husband and I, we drove to the hospital. I was worried, but not super worried. And they, brought me in to sit on the bed, and we went through what I call like the descending layers of hell. Like, first it was like the handheld probe, and they couldn't find any heartbeat. And I was like, well,
Mm-hmm.
the nurse looks really young. She's probably inexperienced. Just like, honestly, I look back now in hindsight, I'm like, my brain was so desperate for excuses
Yeah.
on why he had to be alive. And like,
Yeah.
I just like couldn't face that maybe he was dead. Like my brain wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
allow
Mm-hmm.
that almost. And so the first layer of hell, and then it's like they bring in the next machine, and then they bring in the bigger machine. And finally they got like the biggest portable ultrasound machine where they can look at his heartbeat. And the doctor, I remember, puts the probe on my belly and is like moving the probe, looking to see if she can find his heartbeat and heart, chambers moving on the ultrasound machine. And she actually just said nothing. She didn't say anything to me. There were no words. And finally it dawned on me, he must be dead, because it can't take this long to find a heartbeat with an ultrasound machine. Like, I've seen this before, and usually you can see if the heart is beating within about 0.3 seconds. And she couldn't see anything. And it's like she didn't want to tell me, though, because who wants to utter the words, "I'm sorry, there is no heartbeat," which is hard for anybody to say. It's hard, obviously awful to hear. So I remember her saying that, and I just sobbed. I wailed. Like, I remember just like, I couldn't, a couple things, like I couldn't physically lay still. She actually wanted to take more measurements. She wanted to measure the amniotic fluid. She wanted to, I don't know, measure some other things. And like, I was crying so hard I could not lay still for the measurements. So she just rolled the card away and was like, okay, whatever, no measurements. She was not a very good doctor. The nurses came in though, and they were much better. I remember one nurse asked me, because my brain just like, first of all, it doesn't feel real. It feels like there must still be a mistake. Like, I know I just saw his heart on the monitor and I know it wasn't moving, but there still must be a mistake. Just this denial. It just felt like I couldn't come to terms with reality. Yeah, I remember the nurses, though, were very kind. The first question that one of them asked me is, "What is his name?" And I thought, that is, since looking back on this in hindsight, that's a perfect question to ask somebody who just learned that their baby died. He's real. He has a name. He is part of our family, even though it's going to look a lot different now than if he was alive. So the nursing staff was they walked with me down through this road into the layers of hell. I do remember then, during labor, my friend Jess, she was my doula, and so we had to call her and say, "Jess, he's dead. Like, can you still come and be my doula?" Obviously, we were both looking forward to a living baby and a living live birth. So just in tears, she was like, "Of course I'll come." And she drove down to the hospital and was with me for everything. And that was so essential, because like for the previous 3, like my husband was essentially my labor coach. Even though we had a doula, like my husband was very actively involved, and he was absolutely actively involved too in Elijah's death, but he's going through his own grief. Right. And like, he can hardly breathe and see straight. So there were times where David needed to step out because he was sobbing so hard. And so Jess, my friend and doula, would then step in, and almost like the two of them would sort of alternate between being my support and taking time for themselves to go cry. I remember during labor with Elijah too, there was a lot of denial. I remember just sort of like, hey, to my husband David and Jess, like, let's just pretend he's alive, because how else can I face this horror? And so I remember a lot of like, hey, let's like pretend we're going to watch a movie and go wheel in the movie cart as if we're going to pick out a movie. Or like, I've never had acupuncture before, let's try acupuncture. It was just these efforts to like escape reality. Anything I could do to escape reality. And I remember telling people, like, in the room, like, you have to, like, as I'm in labor and I'm in the work of labor, like, you have to sort of indulge me in my fantasy that this baby is still alive, because I don't know how else to survive this. I do remember, backing up a little bit, I remember right after they told me that Elijah had died, thinking, well, then you're going to do a C-section, right? Because you can't like that's just too horrible and too awful to think about
Mm.
vaginally delivering a dead baby. Like that's not possible. You cannot possibly make me go through the work of labor
Mm-hmm.
and then for a dead baby. And I thought for sure they would never make me do that. And then they were like, yeah, actually you do need to do a vaginal delivery. And in hindsight, that's the right call because I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are risks to C-sections and,
Yeah.
avoiding them if possible is good. And there are absolutely some lost families who, if the mother is, fighting for her own health and her own life,
Yeah.
obviously C-section, no brainer. But I was still healthy at that point. There were no warning red flags for me. And so they
Yeah.
said, yeah, you need to do a vaginal delivery. And in hindsight, that was the right call. But at the time, I thought they were just being cruel. I just thought that was horrible. How could you possibly make me do that? I remember asking for all the drugs they could give me. I was like, just knock me out. I don't want to feel a thing. If you can just make me like fall asleep and wake up and this whole nightmare is over, that would be great. Now,
Yeah.
I did actually slowly shift after he was born. I was in labor most of that. It was actually Monday. I was induced Monday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was born. I was in labor most of that day, and he was born around 8:30 that evening, and that was July 2nd, 2018, and that was his due date. It was like the date I had been counting down to for how many months, and I had looked
Yeah.
forward to it for so long and just
Yeah.
anticipated nothing but joy and, elation, and now it's July 2nd and he's dead and I have to deliver him, and I was trying to survive it. So, but I do kind of like it that he was born on his due date because it's like his due
Yeah.
date is his birthday, and we've got one big day on the calendar that we remember and celebrate Elijah. So it was his due date that he was born. So I remember very strongly, like labor was a lot of like lying to myself, pretending maybe he's alive, just wanting to hit the big red escape button that I wish existed that didn't exist. But after he was born, they placed him in my arms right away, and things shifted slowly but surely at that moment. Like suddenly this wasn't horrible. It was like, this is my son and he's beautiful, and I know that I only get a very short amount of time with him on earth here, and I wanted to hold him every minute I could. Like I didn't want to set him down, not for 1 second. I remember that. I remember the nurse just giving a bath so sweetly and so gently. And after babies are stillborn, their skin gets very, it can tear and rip easily because they don't have the same integrity in their skin as a living baby. And so I remember her just being so careful to keep his skin together.
Yeah.
I remember during labor and then after he was born, so many horrific questions that I was like, how is this even possible? Like they would ask me like, well, do you want to bury him or cremate him? And I'm like, you should be asking me what color my nursery is, not if I'm going to bury or cremate my son, like, but it's like these questions all needed answers because there's like decisions to be made. What funeral home do you want us to send his body to? Do you want an autopsy or not an autopsy?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to have a little memorial service for him at the hospital or not? Do you want information on bereavement resources and counseling and all of these things? And it just, even as I look back on it, I'm like, that is horrific just to be looking forward to this joyful experience, or even the hard work of labor with, looking forward to a living baby at the end. And instead you're asked these awful questions. But one wonderful help was a lady named Kelly. She's from a local like stillbirth bereavement care organization. She's had her own, full-term stillbirth, and she came to the hospital and like guided me through a lot of these questions because at the time I was just like, how do you expect me to know if I want to bury or cremate my baby? Like I have no idea. How do people even decide that? Flip a coin? Like I don't know. What are the pros? What are the cons? Somebody else decide for me. I don't know. But I knew they were important questions. I just didn't know how to make them. And so Kelly was my angel who came along from an organization, and she was like, well, this really sucks to be talking about this while you're in labor and even after he was born, either way, but here's what I did, and here's why I did it, and here's why other people maybe choose this other thing. And she was my navigator and guide through that. So a huge thank you and shout out to those organizations who do that. They go into the people's worst moments and their darkest spaces and help them navigate the worst of the worst.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, what a story. And again, thank you so much for talking about Elijah. And it cannot be it cannot be easy. It's been 5.5 years, but it probably feels like it was yesterday
It
that he
does.
was
Yeah.
born and he was dead, and he was there with
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
but you didn't get to take him home and,
Mm.
watch him grow like you did with your other three boys.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. That's wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And there's so much to talk about in this story because, well, it kind of sounds like, so obviously, how can you expect, Elijah to be dead when you don't feel him? Obviously, you're not thinking about it because, well, in pregnancy, we don't talk about stillbirth. We don't talk about
Yep.
the potential risk that your
Yep.
baby can die in
Right.
utero. And I mean, it's not like it's not happening to every second baby,
Yeah.
but it's not uncommon at the same time. So it's this
Yeah.
area of like it's not that rare, but
Yeah.
it's not that common
Yeah.
that we need to talk about it. But I feel like it's starting to be spoken about maybe a little bit more, especially in terms of if you do not feel your baby move, like, and it's out of the ordinary for your baby, and I emphasize on that from personal experience. If your baby's not moving like he or she usually would, do call your provider, do call your
Call. Yep.
midwife, your
Yep.
obstetrician, do
Or
go
just go into
to
the hospital. Like if they're not
exactly,
answering the phone or it's 2
exactly.
a.m., like just
Yep.
go. Just go
Yeah,
in. Yep.
exactly. And
Absolutely.
something you talked about, which is, we, I think as mom, as women, we want to be a good patient. We want to be the easy patient, not the one that rocks up at 3 a.m. knowing that those midwives, they're on night shift, they're exhausted, they'd
Yeah.
probably like to go for a cup of tea right now and so on, and you don't want to rock up and, bother
Yeah.
them,
Right.
you want to be easy. It's the middle of the night, or, it's like, oh, they've had a difficult day. Yes, but it's their job to guide you. And if
Yep.
you think, you wake
Yep.
up at 2 a.m. and you go, oh, you know what? I haven't felt my baby. Usually he or she's super active through the night.
Yep.
You need to go in. And,
Yep.
you don't even have to call them. You can just rock up and go, you know what? I was in such a panic. I just really wanted
Yep.
to get here. I
Yep.
forgot to call you. Anyway,
Yep.
I'm here now, moving on, like,
Yeah.
so be it.
Yeah. You can say
You
something felt off. You can say,
exactly.
for my mental health, I need to
Yes.
know if my baby's okay. That's
Mm.
100% legit.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And if this is you and you rock up and then you're being basically dismissed, or you're being felt like you're crazy, you should have called, you should be resting at home. If you're being dismissed by any care provider, I want you to say very calmly, thank you for your opinion. I'd like someone who actually cares to come in and look at
Yeah.
my case.
Yep.
And I'm
Yeah.
not even kidding,
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
have been dismissed myself.
Yeah.
And you know
100%.
what? I should have said, please step down, bring me someone that actually cares and actually
Yeah.
wants to look after my health.
And wants to
Because
find a problem if there is a
exactly,
problem. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Because you need to be supported in your pregnancy. If you're not being
Yep.
heard, if you're not,
Yeah.
if you're not cared for, then that person can go and have their cup of tea, and then
Yeah.
they can bring someone in that actually cares,
Yep.
because that's not acceptable. You
Yep.
need to be cared for. You
Yep.
have a right to get, the scan, the ultrasound, or whatever it is
Yeah.
that will reassure you, whatever
Yep.
test. If you're not getting it, then find someone who will provide you with this, this
Yep.
scan,
Yep.
this blood test that will
Exactly.
put your mind at ease. That's it.
Yep.
So you have
And
a right to say,
yeah.
okay, bye-bye. Bring me
Yep.
someone that
Bring
actually
someone else.
cares.
Yeah. I think that's a great strategy. Another line I've heard, like if you just feel like if you feel like something's wrong, but the
Yeah.
provider is not finding anything.
Yeah.
A line I've heard you can say is like, I know you don't see anything right now, but I really think that there's something wrong. I need you to keep looking. Like maybe
Yeah.
that means another test or another scan,
Mm-hmm.
or sit on the monitor for 3 hours.
Yep.
Or there's always something more they can do. You could be
Exactly.
admitted to the hospital for continuous monitoring, right? Like
Yeah.
that. There's always more they can do.
Exactly.
So
That's right.
you can say, I still don't feel reassured. And you shouldn't leave until you do feel reassured. Yeah. And you're not crazy for doing that.
No,
I don't know what the rates are in Australia, but in the US, stillbirth is about 1 out of every 160 pregnancies ends in a stillbirth. I call it the most common of the worst outcomes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in other words, we need to talk about it. We need to address it. And I always say, like, how could a mother possibly defend herself against a risk that she does not know exists.
Mm-hmm.
That's not possible.
Exactly.
It's not fair. It's not possible, right?
Yeah.
We are given trainings on safety around swimming pools, safety around car seats and seat belts. We need to hear about stillbirth too. And like you're saying, what do you do if you're worried? Go into the provider, or, what's your normal movement? Placenta measurements, like all these things are things we can do. We're not just, at the whims and mercies of, fate to see what our outcome is. Like, there are proactive things we can do. And, sometimes we hear from providers, they say, well, I don't want to talk about stillbirth because it will make the patient really anxious or really nervous, or almost like there's this voodoo taboo kind of thing of like, if I talk about it, maybe it's more likely to happen. And I'm like, no, this is the doctor's office. We believe in science here. And we know that education is an important part of, promoting better outcomes. And that means talking about it. And sometimes we get this paternalistic thing too of like, well, she's going to be scared or she's going to be irrational. And you're like, no, we don't do that to any other patient. Just, if I have cancer, I want my doctor to tell me I have cancer, and let's address this head on and let's talk about it. Let's not pretend it doesn't, doesn't exist, or even avoid, risks of cancer and talking about that. So
exactly.
We have to talk about it for it to be addressed. And
exactly.
We're not there yet. We're not there yet.
No, and you're right. It's exactly like, so in Australia, the really big thing we talk about is preventing skin cancer, because we have a lot, obviously the sun is really harsh in Australia. So we talk a lot about, how to protect, your skin from the sun, when not to go to the beach and, so on, right? But we don't talk about the prevention of stillbirth in Australia. We do not talk about it. We measure, we talk about, if you feel like your baby's movement are reduced or you haven't felt your baby move, then definitely come in. And that's only emerging, like the, come in if, your baby's not moving like it normally does. That's only emerging in the last few years. Before that, it was the whole have candy and drink juice, and because it's sugar, it's going to make the baby bounce and or rest. And no, old advice, don't do that.
Don't do
but
that.
we don't talk enough about stillbirth. And in Australia, I looked up the stats, in 2021 it was 2,200 babies that were born, that were stillborn, and there was, I think it was another maybe 500 or 1,000 that had neonatal death, so died shortly or some days or so on after their birth. But we don't talk about it, and we know that a stillbirth is preventable, but it can only be prevented if we actually look at the things that could prevent it. And this is where the placenta comes in. And this is exactly why we're doing this today, because what happened, so after you've delivered Elijah and he's in your arms, and you want answers, you and David, you probably both really want answers, because Elijah was born at term. He was born at 40 weeks. You were expecting his birth any days now. You were expecting to spontaneously go into labor, to have a probably, a tough, as labors are, and then to hear him cry and to go, wow, my fourth son, yay. And it's not what happened. So I'm sure you would have been looking for answers, what happened, what was done after his death to try and give you answers.
So I have like a million thoughts here, but I'll share the brief version and you can ask questions. So actually, at first, I did not want to find out why he died. It was terrifying. It was completely, like, absolutely terrifying. It's hard to even put words to it, because I was so sure it must have been me. It must have been my fault. And I thought, can I live with that guilt and that burden for the rest of my life? That I killed my baby? Can I really do that? Like, maybe it's just better to not know. And I remember thinking, I just want to bury this all. I want to run away. I want to hide. I don't want to talk to anybody on the planet ever again, other than maybe lost families who have endured a stillbirth. That's actually the first week after he died. That was only people I wanted to talk to in the whole world. Only people. If you hadn't lost your baby, then I did not want to talk to you. And so at first, I didn't want answers. I was terrified, but I would say it slowly shifted, especially after I was holding him. I could see this is my son. I felt like I wanted to do my best for him, even though he had died, even if it was my fault. I didn't want to just run away. I wanted to face it and embrace him. And I knew that, with living kids at home and for myself, my husband, like for us to survive this emotionally as a family, like we had to integrate his death into our life and into our story. And part of that is going to be finding out, why did he die? So deciding that, I said, please do all tests, do all labs. I want an autopsy. I want a placenta review, do every single test under the sun. I want it all. One hurdle we face is that can add up to a lot of money for a lot of people. And costs can become prohibitive for families, which is absolutely horrific to have your baby die and then not be able to pay for an autopsy or to be sitting there like out of pocket. It might be $3,000, $5,000. It's a huge problem that we would, force grieving parents who want to know why their baby died and they have to pay this. Anyways, we were able to get all testing done. So the autopsy and the report were done 3 months after Elijah's death and birth. And my midwife called me and she was like, Anne, I don't understand this report. I'm just going to be really honest with you. It's a bunch of pathology, terminology that is just over my head. And so I said, that's fine. You're a midwife, not a pathologist. And I asked, can we meet with the pathologist who did the autopsy? And she said, of course. So she set up that meeting. This was me and my husband and my midwife, Anne, meeting with the pathologist who did Elijah's autopsy. And I will never forget this meeting. I saw the report and I saw it said, okay, Elijah's placenta was less than 10th percentile by weight. And I asked, well, how much less than 10th percentile? Like 9th percentile or like 0.01 percentile? Because those are pretty different. And he was like, I don't know. I'm not sure how much less than 10th. And I was like, well, can you help me find out? He said, nope, I can't help you find that out. And even if I did help you find that out, Anne, that won't bring him back. He was very dismissive. Wow. He was just not interested in finding that out because so much of the report was like normal. And I asked him at the end of the meeting, like, so why did he die? Do you have any cause of his death? And he just said, I don't know what killed your son. I'm not sure. I don't see anything weird here. And I remember, and then he also said, by the way, Elijah was a really big baby. He was 8 pounds, 13 ounces, but his placenta was really small. It was less than, we knew less than 10th percentile, whereas his body weight was 80th percentile. And so there's just a big mismatch there. And so we said, well, because of that, I think maybe the placenta got mixed up. Maybe this isn't the right placenta because this placenta is really small and your baby Elijah is really big. So maybe there's a mix-up. And I was like, can we find out if there was a mix-up? Can you do genetic testing of any sort? And he said, no, can't do that. Don't know how to do that. No, can't help you. Wow. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, like, these questions must just be totally irrational. I mean, they seemed like sensible questions to me at the time, but I was like, he's being so dismissive. These must be stupid questions. I now know that my questions were completely reasonable and very important questions. But, there's just this culture of like, at least I don't know what the pathology culture is in Australia, but in the US, like the placenta is like the least interesting pathology assignment you can possibly be given. They would much rather do like a human cadaver or like, is this cancer or not cancer kind of tests. But just the placenta was like barely not ignored in the report. He did have the weight and he had a few things. He said really looks normal and maybe the placenta got mixed up, but it was almost, there's just nothing interesting about the placenta to him. So I just went home and I was like, I guess this is the end of the road. I'm never going to learn why my baby died. Until I listened to a podcast, Gay Podcasts. There's an interview with Dr. Harvey Kleiman, and he talks on this podcast that actually placenta size is really important. And babies can be stillborn because they basically outgrow their placenta. So he's like, if you have a baby that's like 10 times the size of its placenta by weight, so if the baby is 10 times the weight of the placenta, he's like, that's basically an imminent stillbirth. Baby can't survive that ratio because there's not enough placenta to deliver the oxygen and the nutrients that they need. And I was like, holy cow, big baby, small placenta? Like, what was Elijah's ratio? So I remember I was on a walk at the time listening to the podcast. So I ran home, pulled out Elijah's autopsy report. I looked up his weight. I looked up his placenta weight, divided them, and it was 10-1. And I was like, holy buckets. Did I just learn on a podcast why my baby died? And then I was like, well, surely we can get better than that, right? Do I just like say, oh, I learned on a podcast why my baby died and that's the end of my story? So thankfully, no. I emailed Dr. Harvey and had Elijah's placenta had still been saved. And actually it's routine after a stillbirth to save placenta tissue slices that the pathology department will just routinely save. They don't even, at least in the States, need permission from the mother. They just save it and it sits in the hospital pathology department just in case needed. And so if you have had a stillbirth, you can have these placenta tissue blocks sent to a placental pathologist who is trained to look at the placenta, as Dr. Kleiman is, and there are others as well. And they, first of all, they know and understand that the placenta is important. They know how to look at it, how to analyze it after a stillbirth, what to look for. That was huge. So Dr. Kleiman looked at Elijah's placenta slides and confirmed, yes, he ruled out a ton of other possibilities. And he said, yeah, your son died because his placenta was too small to support him at the end of pregnancy. So huge flood of emotions at that moment. Like, number one, that's not my fault. I did not knowingly control the size of his placenta. Even if you told me, I can't. There's nothing I can do to control placenta size. So just that weight off of my shoulders is huge. But then it opens up this whole new can of worms of like, well, wait, I had ultrasounds at week 35 and 37. Why did nobody look at this? Because if somebody had told me, wow, that placenta, week 37, that's pretty small. Why don't we induce you at like 38, 39 weeks? I think I would have said, sure, if he's in danger, like induce me.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, why did nobody look at this? Is at his placenta size specifically. And so I have since learned it is possible to measure a placenta during pregnancy before a stillbirth happens. I've since learned that there are tons of research studies that show a link between small placenta size and increased risk of stillbirth, and actually an increased risk of a whole host of other, less than ideal outcomes, like a NICU stay or heart defects or genetic issues, or even like mental health issues later in life have been found to be associated with the small placenta. So like there's some underlying physiology thing here that's going on that is really important that we are completely ignoring. So as part of that, this kind of gets into the measure of the placenta story. I just couldn't handle it. And I connected with a number of other lost families too, and with basically the same story as mine. I mean, different mother's name, different baby name, but the whole trajectory of the story is pretty similar. And a lot of these stillbirths happen at full term because that's when the fetus is growing really fast relative to the placenta. The placenta grows sort of at this kind of linear rate, and the fetus grows at more exponential rate, packing on the pounds at the end of pregnancy. And that's when they're at the highest risk of a small placenta stillbirth. So these are have to be some of the most preventable stillbirths, right? Because it's not too controversial to induce a mother at 38, 39 weeks if there's a good reason to do so.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I think there's just still this anger and frustration in me of how could something so reasonable and so simple, like looking at the size of the placenta to see if that gas tank can bring this baby over the finish line, why is this not standard care? Why is this not part of what we're doing currently during pregnancy? So as part of that, I've worked with this other group of lost families, and we started our organization, Measure the Placenta. And we have one simple goal. We want placentas measured during prenatal care considered as a risk factor for poor outcomes. I should say too that extremely large placentas can also be a sign, or they're also correlated or associated with poor outcomes. So that's also worth considering too. Yeah. So our mission, we've been around now for probably 3.5 years, trying to knock on anybody's door who will listen. Why are we not measuring placentas during prenatal care? And that's what we're working on.
Wow, I'm just lost for words that you found out how Elijah died from a podcast.
Isn't that crazy?
By total chance, because you obviously were, either you were looking for, other stillbirth stories, or it was by chance that you found Dr. Kleiman.
Yeah. I was there listening to the podcast for my mental health. I just wanted to hear stories of stillbirth. I wanted to. I actually, it was because I have this research background too, I would actually go to Google Scholar and just type in stillbirth research and just read and learn. I called that my happy place, was stillbirth stories and stillbirth research. And I felt like that's where I needed to be, both for mothering Elijah and my mental health, but also trying to figure out why he died. And
exactly.
But yeah.
And it's incredible. And it is, out of sheer luck, obviously, well, you kind of made that luck in that, you were seeking answers, help, support, reassurance. You wanted to be seen. You wanted to know you were not alone. It's happened before. You're not the only, unfortunately, you're not the only mom that it's happened to. And that is so sad. And you found Dr. Kleiman, who is, I haven't interviewed him yet at this time, but I am so looking forward to chatting with him because his research and the fact that he is willing to come, to my very small podcast to chat about this incredible research he's doing, that, it's a simple measurement that could save lives, many lives, because and it's not difficult. It is, I have looked at it. I am by no way a sonographer. I am not trained to look at ultrasounds, but I can see from the way that Dr. Clemens described it on his website that it is extremely simple to do those measurements. It is explained for sonographers how to do it, which angle to use the probe and so on. And as you said, it's not being done. Why? It would take, a minute, 2 at the most to get the right angle to then take that measurement, take this measurement, put it in this equation and go, okay, this is this volume. And then you would, the sonographer would be able to go, okay, I have a number. I can look at what it means based on research studies, and I can basically interpret the result and go, yes, there is a risk, or no, there is, it's a low risk, or it's a medium risk, or it's a high risk. And that could be saving lives of babies that die in utero at full term or close to full term. And also it would bring answers to moms who just go, well, it's my fault. I couldn't deliver an alive baby. And it's not their fault again. But I wonder, we've come really far from the time that we started doing, ultrasounds back in, I don't know what years, I'm guessing it's like my grandmas didn't have ultrasound back in their pregnancies. And then we've started doing ultrasounds, and then we've started measuring more structures. We've started to measure, the bones, we've started looking at the heart, we've started looking at the chambers, we've started looking at amniotic fluid. So we've come a long way from, back in the days, but there is still so much to learn. And this is how we learn. We learn from people like Dr. Kleiman who do research. That's their job, to do research and to go, hey, medical people, here is scientific evidence that doing this simple measurement could save like hundreds of babies every year. And it's this simple. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. You just go, doom, doom, doom. There you go. That's it.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, it takes time to implement that simple measurement before it becomes routine. There will be years that will go by. Yeah. But, and with this podcast, this is what I'm aiming to do. I'm aiming to give moms this piece of information so that they can go to their sonographer and go, when the sonographer says, okay, I'm done, I've done all the measurements, good, okay, see you never. They can go, wait, hang on, did you measure this? Did you measure the estimated placental volume? Yes. And then the sonographer may or may not have heard of it. And that's when we as patients can educate medical professionals. Right. We can say, well, actually, I read this, or I've learned this, or this is what I've heard. Could you look into it? And then could you do it? Because I will not leave until you do it, basically.
I think this is a huge, important place for some self-advocacy and letting your provider know, or if that's the midwife or the obstetrician or the ultrasound tech, like, this is important, and I need you to do this for me. If you go to our website, measuretheplacenta.org, you'll see tons of links. It will link to the Yale website and like all of Dr. Klein's research, showing the original research articles behind the estimated placental volume. But we also have like patient-friendly tools of like, here's 5 things you need to know about placenta volume measurements. Or here's a summary, like kind of a layperson summary that a doctor could just quick scan, like, oh, here's the summary of the research with links and citations to the original research articles that they can read. And then also like step-by-step instructions for an ultrasound tech so that they know, okay, here's the like important things I need to know. Like you said, the angle of the probe, and like, don't press on mother's belly at all, because that can falsely inflate the placenta width, things like that, where it will tell them how to do the measurement. But for somebody who knows how to do it, it takes 30 seconds. At least in the US, there's no specific billable code. You don't get charged. You're just having an ultrasound. It's just part of the ultrasound that they're doing. So its cost is really not generally a hurdle, or it shouldn't be in the US. If they tell you cost is a hurdle, I think doctors are just making up stuff.
No.
Don't be swayed by that one. But yeah, it truly is not difficult to do. I will address though, like, okay, what's some of the pushback we hear? Like, if this is so easy and obvious, and life saving,
Yeah.
and OBs and midwives, they want to deliver healthy living children. Of course, we're all on
Yeah.
the same team here, trying to, healthy mother, healthy baby. So
Yeah.
I'll tell you some of the pushback we hear, and then why I don't think it's good enough. First of all, we hear really stupid pushback, like, well, my techs haven't been trained. Well, then train them.
Yeah.
We've heard pushback like, well, Dr. Harvey isn't an OB, so he doesn't really know what it's like to be an OB. And we're like, well, it's because he's busy doing research, people. You're like, you're right, he's not an OB. That's because he's a placenta research expert.
Yeah.
So, like, that's okay. Listen to the placenta experts and what they're saying. And what he's saying is small placentas are a risk factor for stillbirth, so we need to get on this. I call that the stupid pushback. But then there's other genuinely harder questions that I think are important to consider, but I still don't think, should prevent EPV from happening. Number one is they want us to show them a definitive, controlled, randomized study that shows if we do placenta volume measurements, it will lead to a reduction in stillbirth. I totally would love to see that study done. However, there's a couple problems. And I'm truly, research is my background. I want to see research studies on this. And we are trying to launch, large scale EPV studies. But here's the issues. Number one, stillbirth, it's 1 out of 160, but it's rare enough that it's really hard to design a study that's big enough to detect a difference in outcome. Because if something has a really common outcome, then you can have a smaller population size in your study. But the rarer the outcome, the bigger the study you need in order to be able to detect the difference between group A and group B. And so basically that study hasn't been done. Like all of the tests that we do for, during prenatal care, say a non-stress test, or for the higher risk pregnancies, I should say. I didn't have any of these before Elijah, but a non-stress test or a biophysical profile or, blood flow through the cord with a Doppler reading, like none of those have any studies behind them showing if you do a BPP, it will lead to a reduction in stillbirth, because that study is either not possible or wildly expensive. And so I think they're holding placenta volume measurements to an unfair standard. It's a standard that's higher than the tests that are currently in prenatal care, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and we've been writing letters. We actually have a letter sending campaign to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They're the ones who set prenatal care standards in the U.S. And we're because they say, well, we want more research. And we're saying, tell us the study. We have people who want to fund these studies. Let's just pretend we had $1 billion. If we had unlimited money, what would the study be? Because nobody's done these studies for other tests. So please don't hold us to a double standard. That's not fair. The studies we do have, I would argue in hand. Number one, we have good studies showing small placentas are a risk factor for stillbirth. There's tons of studies showing that. That research is on our website. And we have good research showing that EPV measurements can detect small placentas. But have we linked it to, if you do EPV, then therefore there will be a reduction in stillbirth? We don't have that study, and I don't know it's possible. So that's one pushback we hear, and why I disagree with the pushback. The other pushback we hear from doctors is, well, give me the decision tree flow chart. Like, if I get this size placenta measurement at, this many weeks, what should I do? Or they'll say something related like, well, if I get a small placenta measurement at 24 weeks, I can't induce that baby. To which we say, of course, like everything else in medicine, like it's balancing risks and benefits. It's balancing pros and cons, and in obstetrics, it's in or out. And you've got to weigh all the pros of in versus all the pros of out, and you've got to compare them. And there's necessarily some judgment calls there. But, should you induce a baby at, even 30, 32 weeks with a small placenta? No, especially not if there's no other warning signs or risk factors. But what you can do is use placenta volume measurements for risk stratification. So let's say you find a small placenta at 30 weeks, you can't induce, that's way too early, but you could send that patient in for more monitoring. You could give her growth scans every month. You could give her a biophysical profile, be checking that amniotic fluid, make sure that she's educated about fetal movements and tracking her normal, educate her to come in if she's concerned. You could talk about maybe inducing at 38, 39 weeks instead of waiting for, a natural delivery at whenever baby decides to come. So there's a whole host of things that you can do besides just, oh no, I can't deliver this baby. No, risk stratify, closer
Yeah.
monitoring. And doctors do this all the time in medicine. Like that
Mm.
is, I'm
Yep.
not a doctor, but that's got to be a significant part of training, is trying to figure out your low risk population from your high risk population that needs more monitoring. And so
Exactly.
that's our sort of pushback to the pushback is, of course, don't induce, just closer monitoring. She's
Yeah.
higher risk. Watch her more.
Yeah.
So,
And we know that we have, in pregnancy, and we do those scans and we do blood tests and so on, right? And we are looking for potential risk factors. We are
yep.
looking for any flags, anything that could say, for example, if the woman does a blood test that shows her blood glucose level is elevated, well, she might be at risk of developing gestational diabetes, or she might
Mm-hmm.
be diagnosed with gestational diabetes.
Yep.
And so therefore, instead of going, oh, this woman's got gestational diabetes, we need to induce her. That's not at all what
No,
happens.
nobody
It
says that.
No, it just means, oh, okay, well, she might be at risk of,
Yep.
and then here are the risks. And then
Yep.
we go, okay, well, to try and, work with those, well, we're
Yep.
going to do growth scans. We're going to check her blood glucose levels. We're going to check the size
Yep.
of her baby. So
Yep.
we've got those, here is the fact, and then here is the potential decision that might be made because of those facts, So we've got that because gestational diabetes and all the research behind it has been around for, however many years.
Yeah.
And so it's basically, this estimated placental volume is emerging. So it's
Yep.
new
Yep.
research. It's not that new though. I mean, it's been around, but it's just stayed like buried somehow
Simmering.
because
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
because there's been research before Dr. Kleiman that showed about, the size of the placenta and its link to stillbirth, yet it just hasn't been picked up, which
Yeah.
is, a whole conversation there.
Yeah.
And so,
That's
and
the
so
truth.
yeah, it's saying, well, if you detect, if you do this one measurement and the sonographer detects that the placenta might be small for gestational age, or, the ratio is off, then it's basically flagging there could be a risk. And it doesn't
Yep.
mean that baby's going to die. It
Yeah.
does not mean that.
No, it doesn't.
But it means, and that's what the system does every day. The system's
Yep.
always looking for flags to
Yep.
then try
Yep.
and work with those and go,
Yep.
okay, you might be at increased risk of this. Let's do those to help mitigate those risks.
Yep.
Why
Yep.
is that not happening with the placenta?
Right.
Because that's the exact same, it's the exact same thing. It's you might be at risk of, but to help mitigate that risk, I'm going to inform you. I'm going to, one, tell you that you might be
Yep.
at risk of having a stillbirth.
Yep.
And two, I'm going to give you scans, blood tests, ultrasound. I'm going to tell you what you can do and what we can measure, what we
Yep.
can do to
Yep.
help mitigate that risk.
Yeah. Because there are things
So
we can do, right?
exactly.
If you doctors say, and this makes sense, you should never do a test if there's no decisions that might flow from that test. And that's not the case with this, right? You go the lower risk track or the higher risk track. And so I will say, I have to share one story that we have a shining star. She's an OB in Rochester, New York. Her name is Dr. Heather Florescu, and she does placenta volume measurements routinely on her patients. And they recently published a case study report of doing EPV on a patient, and they found the placenta was pretty small. And she was like, oh, what am I going to do? She did more monitoring. Later, they found the amniotic fluid index was pretty low. And I can't remember exactly the course. It's in this paper. You should read it. But they found out there were other risk factors then that developed after the small placenta was detected. And they went ahead and induced this baby at 36, 37 weeks, something like that, because other red flags came up. But Dr. Florescu will say it was EPV that led to this mother getting the higher monitoring that caught the low fluid, that caught these other issues. And had the EPV not been done, she might have just been put on the sort of routine track. And who knows what would have happened. We can't say for sure that, stillbirth was averted, but like, she is just such a shining light in the sense of like, she gets it. This is just one measurement. It's one tool in the toolbox. And if any provider gives pushback of like, well, what am I supposed to do with this placenta volume information once I have it? Show them that research paper. It's on our website of like, here's an OB who measured the placenta. She did not panic. She was not worried that the patient would panic when there was a low reading. she calmly was like, let's factor this into your care. It's not rocket science, but it has
No.
been hard to change the system, and it's unfortunate.
No, and it takes so long. And as you said, everyone wants to see research. They want to see evidence on the
Yeah.
paper that there is a definite link, and it will definitely reduce the risks of stillbirth. And it's very interesting because if you think about it, when you ask for that EPV to be done, it's not it's as part of your ultrasound. You're not asking for this special tool to be used or for this special blood to be analyzed in a certain way. You're asking, while the sonographer is doing your ultrasound, while they have the probe in hand,
Yeah.
to use this probe
Yeah.
to continue to look at the placenta.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
and as you said, it takes 30 seconds if you experience it. Probably takes 3 minutes if you're learning it. It's not invasive. It doesn't involve any fancy things that the sonographer may not have.
Mm-mm.
It's using the exact same thing he or she has got, and it's just adding something else. Just like if your baby, for example, has been diagnosed with Down syndrome, let's say, so trisomy 21, the sonographers will look further at the structure of the heart because there is a clear link between trisomy 21 and heart defects. So they will look very closely at the structure of the heart, the chambers, all the tissues around it, the flow, and so on, right? So they will use the same probe and they will look at the heart in more detail than if you do not have a baby with trisomy 21.
Right.
Why isn't it the same for placenta?
Why?
It's
yes.
Yeah, like,
you get it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I do.
Yeah. So I don't feel like our ask here is like, we're not asking them to move mountains or change the system or develop a whole new paradigm or spend $1 million, right? Like, it's a pretty simple ask. So our job at Measure the Placenta, we're just going to keep making noise. We're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep asking people, why aren't you doing this? Would you consider doing this? And there are a number of OBs and midwives and techs now who are doing it. It's not, 5 years ago, I was hard to name one person. But now there are a number, and we're super encouraged by that. So we feel like we're moving the ball in the right direction. The work is slow, but I do feel like we're making progress. And I do believe that 5-10 years from now, it would just be unthinkable to not measure the baby's like critical life-sustaining organ. And then another thing coming down the pipeline is with artificial intelligence. I mean, that could totally revolutionize all of this, potentially in a very, very good way, where, they can just take images of the placenta and know like, oh, these are the crowd of babies at high risk of stillbirth, and that would include size and, whatever other factors that the image can pick up. So that is on the horizon too, as a potential real game changer for this whole.
No, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And so have you still got a little bit of time?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of time. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because one of the last things not the last, but one other thing I wanted to touch on is, so after the birth and death of Elijah, you got pregnant with a baby girl.
Yes.
And I would love for you to talk about pregnancy and conception after such a difficult event as losing your son. How did it happen?
Yeah. So, my fifth pregnancy, she's my daughter, Catherine. She's now a living 3.5-year-old, super active, joyful, delightful. My husband and I knew, like, after Elijah's death, we had thought Elijah was going to be our last. We had 4 babies. That's good. We're done. And then with his death, it was like, no, we wanted to have another baby. Let's see if we can. I wanted to bring a living baby home. It just felt like and there are families who decide that's it. They can't go through pregnancy again, because pregnancy with my fifth, sometimes called rainbow babies, Elijah's death was the worst moment of my life to date, but I would say Catherine's pregnancy was the most stressful thing, if that makes sense. This constant anxiety of wondering, is she alive? Is she alive? Is she alive? Is she alive? You go to sleep wondering if she's alive, and you wake up wondering if she's alive. And it just occupies about 78% of your brain space, all for 9 months. I remember being very hard to emotionally attach to her at the beginning of pregnancy, like throughout first and even into second trimester, like just sort of like I didn't want to think about names. I didn't want to think about gender. I didn't even hardly want to go to my prenatal care appointments, because I was like, well, if she's going to die, then I don't want to have seen her 1 million times on the ultrasound. I don't want to form that bond and that attachment, which I totally understand why pregnancy after loss people do that. Like it felt like a defensive mechanism to protect myself and survive this pregnancy. And I would say it was a totally futile attempt to not bond with my baby. Like, this is my baby, and if I lose her too any trimester, it will be devastating.
Yeah, of course.
And so again, it just feels like this weird mental trick that brains like to play on us, like trying to survive, even it's like maybe not the most, certainly not the most rational thing. But I did bleed as well with her around week 5, I want to say. It was pretty early, and I thought, again, it's a miscarriage, but I knew at this point, going back to baby number 2, that you can bleed in first trimester, and it's oftentimes a miscarriage, but it's not always a miscarriage. And so again, it was a subchorionic haematoma. So with my second baby, like, the hematoma eventually resolved, and I was like, okay, now I'm, regular low risk again. Well, with Catherine, like, I counted over the course of my entire course of prenatal care with my rainbow baby, I had 63 appointments for all of the ultrasound, biophysical profiles, NSTs, times I went in because I was concerned, growth scans, checkup, like all of the things, 63 different appointments. So that was a part-time job right there, was just attending all of my appointments. And they did ask me, like, you don't have to have all these scans if you don't want to, but if you want them, you may have them. And I was like, I want every single scan you will give me. Like, I want to know, like, if there's a chance of catching something is wrong, I want to catch it. If that means I'm, like, admitted to the hospital for continuous monitoring, so be it. I will do anything to bring this baby here alive. But it did also strike me of, like, why does that extreme level of care kick in after your baby's died? Like, what if we, like, distributed these appointments more and, like, give a few more appointments to the patients who have not yet had a stillbirth? And maybe, like, not that I wanted less appointments, but, like, 63 is a lot of appointments for, one pregnancy. So, a common question, did my provider measure her placenta? Yes, it was wonderful. My OB and MFM meaning maternal fetal medicine specialist, they're the high-risk doctors. And after a stillbirth, you're oftentimes referred to a high-risk provider, which I was grateful to be referred there. I wanted a high-risk provider keeping an eye on me and this baby. And both of them were totally fine measuring the placenta. I will say the OB was much better about it. Like, he consulted with Dr. Kleiman. He asked, had the techs, like, he would check in with the techs, are the techs doing it correctly, that kind of thing. He was monitoring it over the course of the pregnancy. Whereas the MFM was like, okay, we'll do it, but we're not going to act on the results. And I was like, that's not my favorite, but I'll take it because I know this is new for you. And so I'll sort of like, fine. I more than anything, I wanted to see the size of her placenta being tracked. There were a few hiccups, especially with the MFM, in that, so placenta volume measurements are supposed to be 3 linear measurements, and then you put them into a formula. So I saw the tech sit down, and she's like, okay, I'm going to measure this placenta, and she'd draw, like, this arc on the screen. I'm like, that's not a line. It needs to be a line. So I can say for sure, it's not the best to go in and just be like, I know my provider and tech have never done this, and they don't even really care if they're doing it well. Like, there's a level of training that you should have. There's a video online they can watch. Dr. Harvey is happy to consult with providers. It really is not hard, but, like, even simple things can be done wrong. So part of my care with my rainbow baby, and this was stressful, was like trying to get the providers to be like, no, it's 3 linear measurements, no arcs, no curves. So that was a little stressful, but they got the hang of it. And by the end, her placenta was tracking. It was always below the 50th percentile. It was oftentimes in, like, 20th, 25th, 30th percentile. And I was like, that's getting a little small for what I want, but that's out of the, danger zone. And sure enough, she was born healthy and alive, and her placenta came in at about the 10th percentile. So it was not spot on, but it was close. And there's always some error in these measurements. But actually 10 to 20%, that's pretty good. 10 to 20th percentile, I should say. Yeah, I mean, of course, I was just delighted when she was born alive and screaming and kicking. And I just could not have been more relieved and more thankful for her screams after she was born. She was born via C-section for breech, which I sort of, like, I don't know if just like the fates were out to get me, but like, of course, remember with Elijah, I was so concerned about him being
Yeah.
breech and so concerned to avoid a C-section. And then my perspective entirely shifted with my rainbow baby. I was like, if she's breech, give me a C-section. Who cares?
Yeah.
I was like, whatever, living baby, that's the goal. And I still like, it's still good to try to avoid a C-section, but I was absolutely not willing to risk a breech birth.
Yeah.
And I know some people are, and you can turn them and do a version,
Yeah.
whatever. But I just was not interested in that. I just wanted her out. The sooner the better. I'm also really glad with Catherine. I had her induced at 37 weeks. I don't know what the policies are in Australia, but in the US, if you've had a full-term stillbirth, you absolutely have the right to a 37-week induction, as long as you understand the risks and benefits.
Yeah.
And I was completely willing to accept the risks of a 37-week baby, and no regrets. There was no NICU stay. She had no issues. So just big and healthy. Like my first three boys.
Yeah.
So for sure, Catherine's pregnancy and birth were all kinds of informed and changed because of Elijah's stillbirth.
Yeah.
The care looked completely different, and my attitudes were different. I went in multiple times because I was like, I just don't feel like something. I feel like something's off. I just need to go in and be seen. I would do that in a heartbeat, just no problem. It was not that it was easy for me to make that call, but I knew that was the right thing to do, and I went right in. And there were no concerns of like, are my providers going to like think I'm weird or think I'm irrational or hysterical? It just not even on the radar. Like, just didn't even exist.
Yeah.
So totally different mindset, different priorities, different pregnancy, different birth, different baby, different outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And what I want to say, I want to bounce back to what you said about, if you've had a stillbirth, at least in Australia, is it, potentially an option for you to ask for an induction at, any stage? And I want to say, well, I don't personally know the answer to that, but if you've had a stillbirth, you've had a loss, you've had a neonatal death, there is maybe something that has been picked up in pregnancy and so on, please ask for an induction. And if you really want that, and as you said, you understand the benefits and the risk of the baby's, health at any point, of your health and so on, then why isn't it an option? It should be an option if you want to have an induction, because it's for your mental health, regardless of anything else.
So real.
It is real.
Do not discount
it. Exactly. It's mental health is as important as physical health. So whatever the circumstances are, if for you, for your peace of mind, for your mental health, you want an induction of your baby, you understand obviously the benefits and the risks, you have been informed, you are giving an informed consent to have an induction, it is your right. And I would say if your care provider says, nah, we don't really do this, bye-bye, bring me someone who will, because that's how it is. And if you're being met with we don't do this is not procedure, blah, 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 go to the next person up, ask for them to step down and to find someone else who will review your case, hear you, listen to you, and discuss. There might be alternatives, that you don't know about, but if you've discussed it, you feel heard, you feel like this provider has actually given me all the alternatives and that I want none of those, I want an induction, so be it. You should be able to have an induction. It is your right. After all, it is your body, it is your pregnancy. How can they say no?
It's such a basic decision that needs to be given to the patient of their mental health versus their physical health, and with lives on the line, I think every person deserves to have that choice be theirs.
Exactly.
And like, at least in the US, there are no hard, fast, firm guidelines for
I think it's the same
level of care, how many scans to do, when to do scans, when to induce. It's provider and patient decision making, and hopefully in collaboration, hopefully with respect for the other person. But it's
anything that comes to health, just because maybe, let's say, two people have diabetes, doesn't mean they will be presenting the exact same way with the exact same symptoms and they will be given the exact same treatment. So we know that anything health has to be personalized. It has to be for the person, for their health history, for the symptoms, how they're presenting, and so on. So we know that it should be the same in pregnancy. There cannot be, you can't just say, for every person who has had a stillbirth, we will do this every single time.
Exactly.
How could you?
Yeah, and I know a lot of doctors do find comfort, shall we say, in like decision tree flow charts, like if situation A presents, then do this. If situation B presents, then do this. But, I really think there's an art and a science to medicine. And those decision tree flow charts absolutely have a place. We want those to be backed by evidence and such. But we would be foolish to say every person with the same data on their chart is going to have the same outcome. That doesn't happen. So there's an art and a science to medicine. And I know for doctors in the US, I don't know about in Australia, but they've kind of got this legal concern in the back of their brain. And they know if they follow this decision tree chart, they're protecting their legal butt. That should not be the primary thing to dictate care. But at least in the States, it plays a major role. And so it can be hard to get doctors to look at the patient, the human being sitting in front of them, and not just the data and numbers and following the chart. So that's your responsibility as the patient, is you need to get the best care for you. And if that means switching doctors or pleading your case or showing more research papers or pleading to their humanity of like, my mental health counts too. I know my mental health isn't on your chart, but it is real and it counts. Then say that.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And I think that's the same in Australia. It's not spoken about enough. The legal, implication of, doctor's decision. And I can only understand that it's hard when you have a license, and you don't want to lose your license because then you can't practice. And you're working within a structure, the hospital, the system. But you can't, it's hard to be rigid and to have strict guidelines for things like health, where it's highly individualized and not everyone will present the same way, and you can't give the same treatment to diabetes patients because they won't respond the same. It's a whole discussion in itself there, the legal implications so on, but it's like I think it's present in like really most countries, I would say.
I think it's just important for the patient to understand that legal background, to realize okay, this is probably part of their decision making and what they're recommending for me, even if that may not be the best thing for me. And your job as the patient is to seek out the best thing for you.
That's right. And that's it. And I think we'll finish on this because I've taken way too much of your time. But thank you so much, Anne.
Of course. I'm so glad I could be here.
Thank you. I'm so glad we could make it work with 16 hours difference between us. It's been so enlightening for me to listen to, the amazing work you do in the US to try and get this simple measurement on the charts for people to just, for moms to prevent, potential stillbirth, for professionals to just know that they're doing everything they can to try and detect potential flags. It's amazing. And I wish you all the best in this advocacy work. I know it's not easy and it takes time, but you guys are pioneers. You're doing so well. Keep going.
Thank you. This is hard work. And so I do appreciate it. It means the world that, people who have not personally had a loss themselves would either, take time to interview or take time to listen and to be part of this, because we need everybody to kind of speak up and raise alarm bells about this until this is fixed. So thank you for reaching out and for your willingness to interview me.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to get notified of when a new episode comes out, please subscribe to this show on your podcast listening platform. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast or share this episode so that other moms can find it. If you would like to tell your own pregnancy, birth, or parenting story, please head to the show notes and you will find a form there to get in touch with me. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I will be with you again next week for a new episode.